Democracy is the form of government applied in most nations of the world, whether directly or indirectly. However, not all countries have the privilege of choosing the representatives, if you can consider this a privilege. More than a third of the world's population do not live under a democracy. That is more than 2 billion people. Let's take China for example, the nation with the largest population in the world, where more than 1.4 billion people are ruled by the Chinese Communist Party and its president Xi Jinping. Can China be described as a dictatorship? Not really, but we cannot exactly say that it's a democracy. But following the same logic, we can't consider the US as a true democracy either. Of course, the concept of democracy is quite abstract and confusing in reality. For example, the word democracy is not mentioned once in the American Constitution, and in the same way, in the vast majority of countries considered to be democratic, the word democracy is not explicitly written into their constitutions. Democracy is very subjective, and its interpretation varies from one country to another. For the first time since the Second World War, the continued expansion of democracy has stopped and decreased in the last 3 years. The argument that a country can become prosperous and achieve its development only through democracy has been ruled out. There are many examples of states that have developed and significantly improved the standard of living of their citizens without necessarily making a democratic transition. Does that mean that we're witnessing the death or disappearance of democracy? Is democracy really necessary for development? What are the advantages and disadvantages of democracy in and of itself? We will analyze all of these factors and possible alternatives in this video. The word democracy comes from the ancient Greek demokrasia, which comes from the word demos, which means the people, and krasia, which means power. The cradle of democracy is in ancient Greece. The pantheon of Athens has become its symbol. It is therefore not that surprising that many world leaders enjoy taking pictures next to this historic monument. But in reality, democracy is a relatively new phenomenon. Of the thousands of years of human history, it wasn't until the past 70 years that we could finally say that most countries are in fact governed by democratic regimes. After the end of the Second World War, the continued democratization allowed fewer countries to enter in conflicts, along with opening up to international trade, at least in America, Europe, and parts of Asia. In the period between the 17th and the 20th century, humanity was plagued by wars, conflicts, invasions, conquests, and so on. In 1816, for example, more than 99% of the world's population lived either under an authoritarian regime or in a country ruled as a colony. Today, 200 years later, 55% of the world's population lives in a democracy, although around 30% still live in authoritarian states. However, what is the criteria that allows us to say that a certain country is a democracy and another is not? In reality, no nation is a pure and perfect democracy. That would be too utopian and unrealistic to consider. On the other hand, no country is a perfect dictatorship, not even North Korea, which holds presidential elections, with only one candidate. Countries with the highest index of democracy in the world are generally parliamentary monarchies. And what is democratic in a monarchy? Nothing really, but that doesn't determine the quality of a country's democratic institutions. Venezuela is not a monarchy, it is a republic, but next to Norway, which is a parliamentary monarchy, the index of democracy leaves a lot to be desired. It has been long argued that the only way for a country to become a developed, egalitarian, prosperous state is through democracy. Countries such as the US, Canada, the UK, and France have long been considered to be proof for this theory. However, some examples dispute this argument as an absolute truth and have even rethought the idea that democracy is truly necessary for the development of a country. Who could have predicted that authoritarian China, the most populated country in the world, would have managed to reach its current state of wealth and development without necessarily following the path of democracy? In fact, part of China's success is due to the leadership and planning that allowed the Chinese regime to liberalize the economy without necessarily involving democratization of the country's political regime. Political power remained intact as the country progressed economically with giant leaps. The Chinese people themselves have not been so dissatisfied with the lack of democracy and freedom, and they had no reason to be. They're compensated by an increase in wealth and a high quality of life. Although, it is undeniable that there are groups and a certain percentage of the population that demand the democratization of the nation and more freedom for the press, especially in Hong Kong, which will soon be officially incorporated into mainland China. In a way, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and other rights of expression have never truly existed in China's recent growth. Tragedies such as the Tiananmen Square massacre have been largely concealed by the Chinese government up until today, so it is still taboo to talk about certain events that took place that year. As China is getting richer and richer and adapting to the higher lifestyle, Xi Jinping has been proclaimed the eternal president of China, inscribing his own name into the Chinese constitution. Xi Jinping knows exactly what he is doing. He will certainly be the president of the People's Republic of China for decades to come. With China's economic power, he will be the most powerful man in the world. He doesn't need to run election campaigns or worry about approval ratings. He will remain present, whatever happens, while other democratic world leaders will come and go. The same reasoning can be applied for countries such as Vietnam, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, among others. Certain countries are resistant to democratization, perhaps because of their culture, but they have grown significantly through their resources or other factors. Economic openness has been vital and necessary for the development of these countries. But with regard to political openness and freedom of expression, little or no progress has even been made at all. Saudi Arabia remains an absolute monarchy, but as the Gulf nation is an essential military ally for the US avoids criticizing this authoritarian state, even if its human rights record leaves a lot to be desired and generates a lot of discomfort for many international organizations. On the other hand, the neighboring state of the Saudi kingdom, Iran, is criticized much more often for its lack of human rights and lack of freedom of expression or political participation. But it is interesting to note that it is much more democratic than Saudi Arabia because presidential elections are still held within the country, despite the fact that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is concentrating considerable power within the country. Iran and Saudi Arabia are considered tyrannical regimes, which could be considered good or bad depending on your political stance. Even in the country that preaches democracy and claims it as an excuse to intervene in other parts of the world, the model of democracy that they have is debatable. The US electoral system is an indirect vote where citizens vote for the candidate they wish to elect as president, but what they actually do is vote for the electoral college members who then make the final decision. This is why on very rare occasions, like the last presidential election, the candidate with less popular votes ended up being elected as President of the United States. The candidate with less popular votes ended up being elected as a President of the United States. Explaining this electoral system would take a whole other video, but in and of itself, the election of the President of the United States cannot be considered truly democratic from the traditional point of view. Explaining this electoral system would take a whole other video, but in and of itself, the election of the President of the United States cannot be truly considered democratic from the traditional point of view. To this day, Trump continues to argue that millions of people voted illegally in the elections and that, for this reason, Clinton got more votes. This dangerous claim does not only cast doubt on the confidence in American electoral institutions, but also questions his personal decisions. Donald Trump's attacks on US institutions have contributed to American mistrust of electoral entities and other organizations whose role it is to protect the countries. For this reason, among others, the United States has ceased to be a solid democracy for the first time in history, according to the Index of Democracy in The Economist. Today, countries like Uruguay and even Spain outrank the United States in democratic rankings. The loss of confidence or hope in democracy has also been one of the key factors to this regression. The fact that candidates get the nominations with the help of lobbyists or by benefiting from the political system discourages people from participating in the political process altogether. As a matter of fact, the West has always misinterpreted China's growth. Everyone was convinced that globalization would lead to the democratization of the world's second economy. China has shown that it is capable of becoming an important global influence without growing through a democratic transition. And it's a big problem for the world. Why? Because the substantial growth challenges the importance of democracy for the development of a society. We now have two giants facing each other. On one side, an authoritarian China that is accumulating more and more power, militarily, economically, and politically. And opposingly, we have the so-called democratic United States, whose notoriety due to recent events is declining worldwide. In the Latin American region, democracy is very subjective. Yes, there are elections, but that doesn't give them the automatic status of being democratic. Of all the Latin states, only Uruguay is a solid democracy in the Economist Index of Democracy. We have seen how a Latin American democracy, Venezuela, has slowly slipped into an authoritarian regime, and along with Cuba, is one of the only two authoritarian states in America, according to The Economist. Bolivia is also on the same track, although Morales has lost the referendum on the presidential re-election. Latin America is not the only place where we find that some democracies are eroding into more authoritarian models of government. In Europe, we have the classic example of Russia. President Vladimir Putin won the last elections and another 6 years in the Kremlin. His victory was already widely anticipated, not only for his popularity, but also for the lack of options offering to an alternative to Putin. On the other hand, it should be clarified that some opposition candidates, such as Navalny, were unable to participate because of legal obstacles imposed by the Kremlin. In the European Union, Poland and Hungary saw their governments grow increasingly nationalistic, anti-European, and xenophobic, while their governments increased their powers. For example, in Hungary, Viktor Orban won a new term in the parliamentary elections with speeches on anti-immigration, nationalism, and protectionism. It is interesting to note that Hungary is one of the countries that receives the least number of immigrants from the Middle East. The same scenario occurred in the UK, where defamation campaigns and lies about immigration may have led the British people to vote in favor of leaving the EU. The same could be said of the American campaign, and honestly, pretty much every Democratic campaign. To have a candidate win an election without lying is practically impossible, even in the most transparent countries of the world. So is democracy necessary for the development of society? There are many different points of views on this question. Democracy guarantees the people to be sovereign and have the last word, but this same principle allows people to elect those who are not truly fit to be in power or unable to run a country. It's for this exact reason that Socrates hated democracy, not because he loved tyranny, but he argued against democracy by giving a very clear example. Imagine that we had a boat with 10 sailors, 2 of whom know the navigational charts. In an ideal world, the 2 most fit are designated by the remaining 8 to run the boat. It is a logical and reasonable decision. But the fact is, the world is not ideal, and sometimes sailors vote for people who are not able to steer the ship and eventually sink it. This is the reality of democracy. This explains why Socrates thought it was a risky idea to give equal voting to everyone, regardless of their education and social differences. Nevertheless, it is obvious that by depriving less educated people within a society of their right to vote would be extremely exclusionary and denigrating, which would only make the society more discriminatory and unequal. Clearly, the subject gives for a long debate, but personally, I see democracy as the only way for a society to achieve economic, social, and political progress. I know that democracy is not perfect and that sometimes it becomes a weapon against people, but so far, I don't see an alternative model that could replace the current democratic model. So I pass the question off to you. Do you think that democracy is still the most ideal way to run things, or should we integrate models, such as that of the Chinese model, in order to sustain societal development and progress? Let us know in the comments below.